In this video, I want to talk about the internal knowledge problem. So economists have specified a knowledge problem that exists for society, which is underpinning the socialist calculation debate. And I really want to drive deep into this point about how knowledge problems exist within organizations as well. Now, the socialist calculation debate occurred at the turn of the century, and it was the biggest debate in economics about the viability of different economic systems. And I think it's really important that you understand what the outcome of that debate was, which is that capitalism was deemed to be a more effective economic form of organization than socialism, but also to understand why that's the case. And it rests on the claim that rationalist socialist planning is impossible. The idea that a socialist economy is incapable of rational planning. Now, why is that? Socialism is the public ownership of the means of production to advance material prosperity. Now, this definition has probably changed over time, and these days people will define socialism slightly differently, and in some cases different to this definition and different to each other. But for the purpose of the socialist calculation debate at the turn of the 20th century, socialism was advocated in particular as a means of advancing material prosperity. And it's important to recognize that it wasn't delivered as a means of generating things like equality or solidarity, but it was advocated particularly because it would make people richer. Now, socialism is the public ownership of the means of production. By contrast, capitalism is where the means of production are privately owned. So it comes down to this ownership, whether or not the means of production, whether capital goods are owned by the public, whether they're owned privately. The stated goals of socialism were increased prosperity. The claim was that socialist systems would make people richer, an efficient use of resources, the elimination of business cycles, and the elimination of monopoly power. Also, an equitable distribution of wealth were stated aims at the onset of this debate, but it's only recently with the failure of socialism for example, that we saw with the collapse of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, when capitalism was deemed to have empirically beaten socialism, is when some of these claims of, for example, making people richer have moved to one side and the equitable distribution of wealth has kind of taken over. According to Ludwig von Mises, socialism is the abolition of rational economy. Exchange relations between production goods can only be established on the basis of private ownership of the means of production. Rational economic activity is impossible in a socialist commonwealth. So he wasn't saying here that socialism is impossible. What he's saying is that rational economic activity is impossible within a socialist system. He's saying that for economic activity to take place in a rational way, it has to take place in a capitalist system. Now, the reason for that is because of the calculation problem, which we can summarize as follows. Private property exists in a capitalist system and is necessary in order to enable economic exchange. If we don't have private property, then we don't have economic exchange, because exchange involves the transfer of ownership of goods from one person to another. And the reason this is important is because that we need economic exchange, we need economic transactions, we need trade to take place in order to generate prices. And so this in a nutshell explains the problem with socialism, is that if you take away private property, then you kind of take the rungs out of the ladder of the information content needed for rational economic activity to take place. Without private property, there's no exchange. With no exchange, there's no prices, and no prices means that there's no knowledge. So when Mises spoke about the impossibility of rational planning, he's saying that you don't have the prices if you have a socialist system. He talked about how under socialism people are groping in the dark. They cannot see, there's no lights, because they don't have those prices which serves as signals in a market economy as to how entrepreneurs should plan their behavior. One of Hayek's most famous articles was called The Use of Knowledge in Society. He made a distinction between scientific knowledge, which is the knowledge of general rules, and the knowledge of time and place, which are the facts of your immediate surroundings, or the special knowledge of circumstances of the fleeting moment not known to others. Hayek is somebody that people talk about in terms of tacit knowledge, so it might be knowledge that you can't articulate, but also this kind of fleeting characteristic whereby you have access to some information or some knowledge that simply doesn't exist outside of somebody's immediate surroundings. Nobody disputes the fact that in a socialist system you can have a lot of scientific knowledge. There can be a lot of understanding about how to perform certain tasks. But what you don't have is the knowledge of time and place, whereby people are able to communicate with each other the special knowledge of circumstances of these fleeting moments. The knowledge issue that Hayek identifies, he said the practical problem arises precisely because these facts are never so given to a single mind, and because in consequence it is necessary that in the solution of the problem knowledge should be used as dispersed among many people. So the knowledge problem is how do we get the knowledge that is dispersed amongst many people into the hands of those who need to make decisions. Because in the real world, we don't have individual single decision makers that possess all of the knowledge required to be able to make effective decisions. I think one of the problems with the socialist calculation debate was at the time, some people thought that this was simply a mathematical or a computational problem, and that if we had better quality computers, then we would be able to solve the knowledge problem by being able to kind of efficiently transfer this knowledge at speed. But Hayek and Mises were talking about a much deeper problem than this. It's not simply a lack of computational, it's about the institutional system that you have in place that allows that knowledge to be shared and acted upon. Prices play this pivotal role here. So the reason why rational economic planning is impossible under socialism is because you don't have accurate market prices, and we need for rational planning accurate market prices. This is because the price system is a surrogate for knowledge. As Pete Boettke points out, there's three roles of prices. Prices have an ex-ante function. They allow us to forecast the profitability of future projects, so we can look forwards and use profits as use prices as a means of forecasting. Ex post, they tell us whether or not past projects were in fact profitable, so it allows us to understand whether historic actions were wealth creating or not. And then thirdly, the discovery role is that they alert entrepreneurs to potential projects. So the profit motive is important, but the profit motive rests on the price system, and the price system showing where people should be diverting their time and their attention and their activities. Benchmarking is a nice way to find some suitable measures. So this is a nice kind of, we think about the price system within an organization. We can think about prices as being an important coordinating device. Southwest Airline were the industry leader in on-time arrivals. Who could they benchmark for improved performance? Well, if you're the industry leader, then there's no one better than you. So the reason I like this example is that then when they were trying to improve their performance, Southwest looked at NASCAR and benchmarked themselves against NASCAR. So this is a really nice example of the importance of benchmarking and looking broadly as to one particular type of knowledge process that organizations can have, which is who you're comparing yourself with in terms of performance. According to the chair of Koch Industries, Charles Koch, a knowledge process can be defined as methods by which we develop, supplant, share, and apply knowledge to create value. So that's what he defines as a knowledge process within his organization. The point of a knowledge process is to ensure that knowledge is effectively acquired, that you measure productivity where possible, that you share knowledge with peers through constructive dialogue, Those three ways are ways in which we can test for ourselves whether or not knowledge is being shared productively within the organization. Benchmarking is one way to do this. We can talk a little bit in the future. We'll talk about metrics, but at a societal level, it's prices that are doing this heavy lifting. So this example of Toyota is a nice example to think about internal knowledge processes here. Toyota assembly plants have a number of cords that dangle at various points along the assembly line. If an employee spots a problem, instead of communicating to a superior who would decide what action to take, the employee themselves can shut down production. So this is in stark contrast to a traditional assembly plant. For example, American and European assembly plants would require 25% of their floor space to correct faulty vehicles that come off the production line, whereas Toyota have very few cars needing repair. This is a classic example. But what it's demonstrating is that whereas in an American and European assembly plant, traditionally, if you spot a problem on the assembly line, you need to alert a superior, you'd alert your line manager, and the line manager would make a decision on what to do. At Toyota, the employee themselves can shut down production by pulling on one of those cords. Now, if we want to think about how this works in a Toyota versus a European or American assembly plant, I think this diagram is very instructive and useful. What this is saying is that all organizations possess decision rights and knowledge. If we think about knowledge, though, for example, knowledge tends to exist in a dispersed and fragmented form throughout the organization. By contrast, decision rights tend to exist in a concentrated form, and that's typically held at the top of the organization. So in an organizational setting, we have dispersed knowledge, as Hayek referred to the knowledge of time and place, this knowledge of the fleeting moment, but we also have the decision right. Now, traditionally, within an organization, if you notice something, for example, you work on the Toyota assembly line, so if you work in a European or an American assembly line traditionally, and you notice something, then what you're supposed to do is to inform a superior, and that information or knowledge is supposed to flow up the chain of command to the decision maker. And this is how a hierarchy functions. A hierarchy functions by bringing information from the bottom up through the organization to those who are in a position at the top to be able to make a decision. Now, the alternative to this is what we see in Toyota, which is where the decision right, in other words, the ability to control and mobilize resources, in the case of Toyota, it's the authority to be able to shut down the production line. In that case, the decision right flows down the organization to the people that have the particular knowledge. And this is looking not so much at a hierarchical framework, but more of a market-based framework. Because if we think about socialism versus capitalism, in a socialist system, information is supposed to flow up the chain of command to the central planner, and the central planner makes decisions about where resources are moved. In a capitalist system, the decision rights, in other words, the authority to be able to mobilize resources, are not held with any individual in advance. Those decision rights are obtained by the participants who feel that they have the best knowledge of time and place. Decision rights in a market flow down to the people who are on the spot and believe that they have a profitable idea. So this is how we kind of think at a societal level, socialism versus capitalism. Of course, a firm is a hierarchy, and so firms are built in this hierarchical system where knowledge has to flow up. But we see in the example of Toyota circumstances where we can take this slightly different approach, and we can ask this question, well, do we want the decision rights to be concentrated at the top, or do we want to have mechanisms that allow those decision rights to flow throughout the organization and give individual people that happen to have knowledge of time and place more ability to take resources on for themselves, and to be able to demonstrate that they have that local information. Now, when we talk about this similarity between markets, and organizations, it's really important that we recognize that firms are hierarchies. And so there's a reason why firms exist, and it doesn't make sense to try and reduce everything to market type situation. We're thinking about how firms can be more market like, but obviously there'll always be an important distinction. The key distinction is about alienability. So if we think about a market, in a market, assets are alienable. And what do we mean by alienable? Well, what we mean is that if we have a system of private ownership, then you have control rights, which means that you can sell it, and you have cash flow rights, which is that you can keep the proceeds. So in a market system where we have private ownership, what we mean by ownership is that you have the ability and the authority to be able to sell something. You can control whether or not you transfer the ownership to somebody else, and if you do transfer the ownership to somebody else, you keep the proceeds of the gains. Now this is very different from a firm, because in a firm, by definition almost, the assets are not alienable. The assets are owned by the organization as opposed to the individuals. You don't have private ownership over the equipment that you use at work. If you did, you would be a subcontractor. An independent contractor owns his tools, but an employee does not. Decision rights seek to replicate the alienability of assets within a firm, though. So organizations that try to have this more market type function, move away from the hierarchical model, will use this example of decision rights as a means of replicating the alienability of assets. It's not kind of full control rights, but a decision right is something where you have partial control over something. In some cases, maybe you need approval, maybe there's conditions around what you can do with that. But the aim is to try and move things more over into the control of the individual employee. So one thing might be that you own your budget, for example, that managers have ownership of their budget. Again, the test here is whether or not you can sell it and whether you keep the proceeds if you do. So if you have an organization that says that we have lots of market type setups, we have loads of different business units, managers have control of their own budgets, we have all of these different profit centers, and yet if the manager comes in under budget and the proceeds go into some central pot, then you don't have decision rights and you haven't replicated a market type system. The alienability here implies that you need to not only control your budget, you need to have authority over what you can do with it, you need to be able to have some cash flow rights as well. Maybe not complete ownership in terms of full cash flow rights. Obviously, in a market economy, we have taxation. So if you sell an asset, then you don't keep all of the proceeds. Often you'll be taxed on it. It might well be in an organization that you don't keep all of the proceeds. And maybe you can think of this in the sense that the organization is kind of imposing an internal tax. And that might be perfectly consistent with a market economy. But there's a big difference between whether or not the board are saying that you as a business unit owner, if you've saved some money, then you get a known share of that. Maybe you get 70-80% of that for next year. If in terms of if all you get is a kind of ad hoc bonus or something like that that's not tied to the value of the savings that you've made, then this might be companies that are in pretending to have decision rights and pretending to have market type institutions, but not actually providing them. Now, the danger or the risk of having these types of assets within the firm that are given to the control of business unit managers is that they sell them for their own benefit, that they make bad choices. So you need to have a control system in place. A control system has to have effective measures and incentives. And if you think about, ultimately any organization is trying to generate good measures and good incentives, then this just comes back to the Jensen and Meckling diagram here, where your incentives and your measures are contained in the decision rights and the knowledge. So when we talk about the information content is your knowledge within the organization, that's how you measure, how you understand what's going on, and then your decision rights there provide your incentive function as well. So firms are never going to be the same thing as markets. We don't have private ownership within an organization, but we can move in that direction, and we can try to create a kind of quasi system where we have some decision rights that mimic what happens under private ownership. Now, some companies don't do this, of course. Some companies embrace hierarchy, and it might be because those companies think that socialism is better than capitalism. So if they're saying that hierarchy is better than market systems, if they think that collective ownership is better than private ownership, then you wouldn't be seeking to do this within an organization. You'd be saying that the benefit of the organization that we have is that we have collective ownership, and we strongly believe that by having collective ownership, people will all be motivated to work in the interests of the common good and work very hard, and their motivation comes from helping each other rather than from trying to provide their own goals and objectives. What we're doing here is we're making the assumption that you're trying to replicate the market-based system that happens in a capitalist economy, because you've already acknowledged the superiority of capitalism over socialism at a social level, and therefore we're interested in trying to think about how we can replicate those institutions to get the benefits of them within an organization. So how do we engage in economic calculation within the firm? Where do these measures come from? One thing we can look at is metrics. So we can think about a metric that we might have to try and have a measure. Where do we get those metrics from? Possibly through benchmarking, and I showed you the Southwest airline as an example. But again, what I'm really trying to get you to think about in this lecture is that at a societal level, it's the price system that does this heavy lifting, and there are ways in which this price system can operate within an organization. So I'll talk more about internal markets in just a bit, but if we just think about metrics for now, this is typically one way in which firms introduce knowledge measures, is through some kind of a metric. The danger is that by introducing a metric, you're providing a potentially a perverse incentive. So if you choose the wrong metric, then you may be incentivizing behavior that's attuned to obtaining the metric itself rather than a wider concept of what constitutes value. So famous example of suboptimal knowledge measures. For example, the famous cartoon of a Soviet nail factory. The measure was the total weight of nails being produced. So this was how knowledge was being measured. The outcome was a 1-ton nail. So this is meant to be a kind of funny joke that if your way of measuring performance is based on weight, then people will end up making nothing to do with what consumers want, but just how they maximize that metric. Some other examples, the CIA paid people based on the number of policy reports produced. They thought that this was an effective way of capturing activity that was taking place. On the surface it is. It's a fairly reasonable measure of performance as to how many policy reports are being produced, but as soon as you start tying that in, as soon as you start rewarding people based on their achievement of that measure, it's no surprise that we end up with lots of reports that no one reads. Charles Dickens, this is one of my favourite examples. The number of words were used as a knowledge measure. In the case of Charles Dickens, he was being paid as a consequence of how many words were included in the books that he wrote. Outcome was that the books were longer than they otherwise would be. If you've ever read a Charles Dickens book and been a little bit daunted by the size, that's one of the reasons. It's a faulty incentive mechanism. And then another nice example is a computer company that paid people based on the number of bugs that they fixed. So the software developers, one of the measures was how many bugs they fixed. But the consequence of this was that they would write sloppy code so that there would be lots of problems to fix in the future. Now, these are just kind of classic examples of how if you tie your measures to incentives, then you can end up with suboptimal circumstances. Any metric that we form has this potential danger. So it might be the case that we have metrics, but we don't necessarily tie them to reward. Of course, if you're not tying those metrics to any reward or incentive mechanism, then it asks the question about whether or not they're doing their job. And so what I want to get from this is to say that you don't have to resort to metrics. You could actually rely on prices on an actual internal market where you're measuring value directly. An internal market is an institution through which members of the same company buy and sell goods using a price mechanism. So a market is where people buy and sell things, and so if you're doing that within a same company, we have an internal marketplace. We can see some examples of this. Markets allocate resources. So BP wanted a mechanism by which they could try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Back in the 1990s, they created an internal market for people to trade their proclivity to generate emissions, and this meant they hit their reduction target 9 years ahead of schedule. Hewlett-Packard introduced an internal market where employees were able to buy and sell rights to computing power. So when they were doing new product development, one of these scarce resources is computing power, and each team that's involved in the process is competing over how much of that scarce power they're able to use themselves. So Hewlett-Packard said that you now, whatever power you wish to consume, you need to bid for, you need to be able to buy it. And by buying and selling those rights, not only did it allocate the power more efficiently, but it also meant that they learned as to how valuable that power was, and by seeing how much different teams were willing to pay for it, it really made them realize what the value of it was. My favorite example of an internal market was when NASA introduced an internal market for the Cassini mission to Saturn. This was one of the first times that the NASA mission came in under budget. It was an incredibly successful internal market. There was a wide number of different elements to this market. You can think of whenever you're putting together a spaceship, you've got things like weight is a scarce resource. Lots of different teams are going to come up with equipment that is going to have weight. It's going to have volume as well. Some things are small and heavy, some things are big and light, but the overall mission has a constraint over the weight and the volume. Also, the computing power was an issue, energy consumption. So all of these different factors, usually, historically, there would be oversubscribed, and so this would end up in meetings where different teams would have to lobby to be able to go beyond what they'd been allocated. In the Cassini mission, they set up an internal market. Instead of lobbying each other, instead of having meetings whereby senior management team would have to argue on behalf of their own teams to try and work out who would get the bigger share of these different scarce resources, they created an internal market. It allowed the individual teams to trade, to buy and sell. They were able to post offers. They were able to say to another team, if you want to take some of our computing power, we want to take some of your weight. And in doing so, what was traditionally seen as being the most scarce resource, actually they found they economized on that so well, because it was so expensive to start off with, that they ended up coming under budget on some of those things. Also, though, as I hinted at, it's not just about allocating resources, it's also about uncovering information. So when people bid on things, you're not only determining who gets to receive them, but you're also finding out how much people are willing to pay. So this is the real knowledge function of markets, is that you're understanding the value of the goods being traded. HP gave salespeople shares to trade futures contracts on printer sales, and this internal market, beat their official forecasts. Another example, Eli Lilly, traders bid up the value of the drugs that became most popular on the market. So what they did was they created internal market so that people that worked for Eli Lilly could essentially bet, they could buy contracts in drugs that were at development stage. There was obviously already information about which drugs people deemed to be the most likely to become a blockbuster drug, but that was based on individual expertise, when they gave everybody within particular parts of the organization the opportunity to buy or sell contracts that related to whether or not those drugs would be successful, they found that the most popular markets were the ones that were those that were traded by the most people. There was high liquidity in them, and they found information that was novel, that was new, and was surprising. It may well be that a lot of the insights of the market, if it is knowledge of time and place, if it's knowledge of a fleeting character, in a normal organization, that never finds its way up that hierarchy to the decision maker, and it kind of gets left on the shop floor. Whereas a marketplace where people are trading generates a real strong incentive for all of that knowledge to find itself in the market and provide those really useful signals that decision makers can look at. Google is another example. They used internal markets on likely launch dates. There's a wonderful Harvard case called Prediction Markets at Google, and for me at least, that's the kind of the definitive example of a company successfully employing internal prediction markets. Just finally, there's a lot of data on prediction markets, and there's a lot of evidence and research on it. This is just one study here that compared market predictions in terms of presidential elections. If we compare prediction markets and opinion polls, there's a very strong track record when it comes to presidential elections that the prediction markets are more accurate than opinion polls. And we have fairly good, strong evidence now that says that if you want to know what's going to happen in the future, instead of asking an opinion poll, instead of asking people who they would vote for and then relying on sampling techniques to ensure that you have an adequate sample of the entire voting population, then setting up a marketplace where people can simply bet on their beliefs, people can contest their different perspectives, is going to give you more accurate information. So just to summarize and to sum all of this up, companies have internal knowledge problems, whether or not they explicitly acknowledge them. Again, this is coming from the book called The Science of Success by Charles Koch, who is somebody who read all about the socialist calculation debate and understands very well the economic theory that's presented in this presentation. And he's the best example, I think, of a business person, a CEO, who has led an organization with a very clear focus on trying to think about what are the implications of this theory to management and how can they be adopted. And he would point out that the characteristics of companies that solve their internal knowledge problems are, firstly, that sunk costs are ignored. So the company doesn't make decisions based on costs that cannot be reclaimed. Profit centers clearly measure value creation. So we have the use of profit centers as a way of using profit and loss accounting, not just at the top of the organization, but at business units throughout the organization, so that we can measure value creation as clearly as possible. Resources are transferred within the firm at opportunity cost. In other words, we're not subsidizing. Resources are being transferred accurately. If departments need to use resources as part of their activities, then we're making sure that the value of those activities exceeds the genuine costs. Departments are not cross-subsidizing, so we're not seeing that some people are generating value, but that's being hidden because they're incurring the costs that are being created elsewhere. There's an open-minded approach to benchmarking. So I gave you the example of using NASCAR as a benchmark for the airline industry. And then employees challenge procedures regardless of hierarchy. So this goes kind of way beyond the tools that are being employed, but just this is the cultural attitude that employees have, which is that they have this inbuilt recognition that hierarchy is not always the best way to organize economic activity. And just because somebody is your superior doesn't mean that they have access to better knowledge than you do. It means that employees recognize that they may well be in a position where they have access to the best knowledge, and it's their responsibility and obligation as an employee to act on that knowledge that they have. So at an organizational level, you want to set up the institutions that make that easy, and markets are a way in which we can try and flush out this information and knowledge. But at an employee level, you have this understanding that you also have an obligation to be thinking about how you can proactively present that knowledge, regardless of where you sit in the org chart. Now, this stuff isn't easy. Koch Industries is one of the biggest private companies in the world, so by anyone's criteria, it's successful. But Charles Koch himself would not say that this is easy to do or that he's succeeded in doing it perfectly. These are all kind of open questions and open challenges that firms have to deal with. But what I find very important with these ideas is that many companies are not even asking the questions. So many companies aren't even asking the question about what are our internal knowledge processes, how are we trying to make sure that we're measuring value within the organization, how are we trying to understand where the best use of resources are. And if you're not asking those questions, you're not going to come up with the right answers. So I hope that by looking at this kind of big debate amongst capitalism and socialism at a societal level, hopefully you can kind of see some clarity on how that argument went and what the pros and the cons were, but also see this relevance within organizations. And even though by definition an organization is a mini hierarchy, it doesn't mean that all organizations should be run as a socialist planning agency with a central planner at the top making all of the decisions. We know that for society as a whole, economies are more effective, wealth is greater when we have a network where we have decentralized process of entrepreneurs who are able to bet on their own beliefs without having to get permission from a central figure of authority. That competitive, creative process by which entrepreneurs act is what generates the incredible wealth that free societies have generated. And there is an element to which we can apply that within organizations and say, even though we have a firm, how can we introduce market type settings to do that? It involves knowledge processes. In some cases, it implies good metrics. But in other cases, it might even imply an actual internal market.